Hello, I'm Tripti Nath, and I'm honored to have on our show today Ambassador Pankaj Saran, convener of NatStrat, a center for research on strategic and security issues. Ambassador Saran has been the Deputy National Security Advisor of India. A career diplomat, Ambassador Pankaj Saran has served at Indian missions in Moscow, Washington, D.C., Cairo, and Dhaka. Welcome once again to the show, Ambassador Saran. It's truly our privilege. As I told you, we're going to be discussing on India's grand G20 presidency. And in his monthly radio program, Man Ki Baat on Sunday, Prime Minister Narendra Modi described India's G20 presidency as people's presidency. To what extent do you agree with his observation?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for hosting me and inviting me to this show to discuss perhaps the most topical issue of the current times, which is the G20 presidency. I think what the Prime Minister has said has been implemented in practice, in the sense that the G20 outreach by the government in India has gone beyond the confines of government offices or even chambers of commerce. It has been taken to every corner of the country. He has ensured the widest possible participation of people in the events. In fact, although most of the meetings have been on very serious issues, the fact is that the manner in which they have been organized and planned and held has ensured that they have caught the imagination of the largest segments of Indian society,
Right.
including in tier 2, tier 3 cities. And so he has tried to make it inclusive in the spirit of the motto of the presidency, that it is not something that is exclusive. It is unlike what we have seen in the past, where, if you remember, in some of the earlier G20 summits, we have seen lots of agitations and street protests
Right.
against the G20 and against the rich nations. But in this case, we have actually spread it all across. So that is the essence, I think, of what he said, by trying to develop a stake of the people in what the G20 means, and also by relating it to their day-to-day lives. I think that is really important.
And of oneness.
Yes, the whole concept that India is a large, diverse but united country, united by a common ethos and common civilization, that has come across. And I think the message to the whole world is that India represents a microcosm of humanity.
Right.
It has everything that the world is aware about, and yet we are developing ourselves as a democratic society in a democratic framework. So I think we have set new benchmarks for the G20 grouping, because otherwise it was traditionally a very formal, limited, and a highly, I would say, intense set of issues that were discussed, and in terms of participation. So it was not easy to relate to the citizenry. I think in this case, he wants to make it a non-elite event and take the issues which affect every single person in India and outside.
How has India fared in addressing the G20 priorities of green development, climate finance and life, accelerated inclusive and resilient growth, accelerating progress on SDGs, technological transformation and digital public infrastructure, multilateral institutions for the 21st century, and women-led empowerment?
Yeah, so you've read out a lot of the critical areas of focus. So these are all the issues on which India wants to put its stamp on its presidency, because these are all issues of importance not only to India but to the world. And I think there's been huge success in bringing all these issues to the forefront of the agenda. You know, when the G20 began in 2008, the primary objective at that time was to revive the collapsed global economy.
Right.
And emergency measures were taken in terms of financial infusion, capital flows, stabilization of capital markets. So it was a very, very economic and finance-centered agenda.
Mm-hmm.
Today, what India has done is to diversify the agenda and convey the message that growth and economic development are critical, but there is so much more to human livelihood that the G20 is perfectly within its remit and mandate to address these issues. So if you pick even on a few of these issues, let us say climate or sustainability, it is central to the future of mankind. And India has shown remarkable progress in terms of its green development path.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you look at digital public infrastructure, what India has been able to show is how you can actually telescope a relatively less developed economy into making fast changes in the welfare and the prosperity and the empowerment of its people. So these are examples of how you can transform lives. And I think the message India is giving in this presidency is that the G20 actually should also address and have the responsibility to cast its eyes on all aspects of life. And we proved it through action. I mean, in the health sector during the COVID, in terms of our record, in terms of vaccinations, in terms of supplying medicines to the world. So there is all that we have done. But more than that, I think the most important today is that India is actually, according to the IMF and all other major organizations, the fastest growing economy in the world.
Right.
So if you look at, say, for example, the IMF projections for 2023 and 2024, vis-a-vis the United States, the Eurozone, and the rest of the middle and emerging economies, then the Indian growth rates are projected at above 6.5 or so, which is higher than any other country in the world. The Eurozone, for example, is projected to grow at perhaps, 1%.
Wow.
The United States around the same value. China is projected to grow at around 4 to 5%. So India is today the bright spot in the global economy at a time of great shock arising from the Ukraine conflict as well as the COVID pandemic. So that it really is something which is the most outstanding in terms of everything else. And on top of that, some of the Indian success stories in transformation of the lives of such a vast population. These are all examples which India is well within its right to provide to the rest of the world, not just the G20.
How would you look at the Russian President Vladimir Putin's recent phone call to Prime Minister Narendra Modi that he would not be attending the G20 summit, but he would instead send his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov? Was this expected?
I think it's very unfortunate that Russia is not attending at the summit level. It's not good for the G20. It is not good for the world. It's not good for peace and harmony, which that is the motto of the Indian presidency. So I think on the whole, it's unfortunate that he has chosen not to come. Having said that, I think his decision has nothing to do with the state of the India-Russia relationship. But it has everything to do with Russia's relations with the G7
Right.
and the collective West. And this is something which is going on between the two of them. And we unfortunately have very little to say in kind of helping matters, although in our public statements right down from Prime Minister Modi downwards, we have been advocating that the only way forward to resolve and to reduce tensions is dialogue and diplomacy. So I would say it's unfortunate, and I do hope that his absence will not affect the outcomes of the summit, and that we will be able to have a consensus G20 communique, which I think is important, because we have to understand that the G20 is not a political body. It is not mandated to address political or security issues. Its primary mandate is finance and economic development. And to the extent that any shock in the world, whether it is a military conflict, whether it is a natural disaster, affects international finance, international growth, trade, yes, the G20 is the competent body. So when it comes to energy, food, fertilizer, inflation, energy problems, all that is something which the G20 can address and should address. But I don't think we should bring politics into this framework.
It's a bad precedent also.
I think so. I mean, because there are other forums to handle all these issues, including the Security Council and the United Nations and so many others. I don't think the G20 is the place where we can sort out conflicts of a strategic nature or a political nature.
Right. Now, China is the only country to have opposed the inclusion of the Sanskrit phrase Vasudev Kutumbakam. The world is one family in documents pertaining to last month's G20 Energy Ministerial meeting, as also other G20 documents. They have reportedly raised the point that Sanskrit cannot be used because it is not recognized by the United Nations as an official language. The theme of the G20 presidency in English is One Earth, One Family, One Future. How do you look at their argument?
I think it's actually at one level quite specious because at one level they keep saying that India and China are the two largest civilizations and two oldest civilizations of the world, right? And they say that that is an argument and a reason good enough for both India and China to coexist and to develop together. But having said all that, when it comes down to their implementation and to their actions on the ground, they don't match with these lofty principles that they espouse. I mean, Sanskrit is one of the oldest languages of the world. I mean, it's like
the mother of all languages.
Mother of all languages, and there are estimates that it's probably 3,000 to 4,000 years old. So it reflects more of a petty mind, I would say, a bit of a hint of jealousy, and inability to give respect or to acknowledge that another country of your size has also got a civilizational history which it wants to put forward, and which actually is accepted by the entire international community. Every single country in the world, no one has a problem except for China. So I think here the onus actually lies on China to show that its objections have any merit at all, or they are born out of very narrow strategic and political calculations. But I don't think they'll carry weight or muster among the global community, because everyone knows what Sanskrit is, and everyone knows India's civilizational contributions. And this will be seen more as settling scores with India. And it doesn't really behove China's role or its professed role as an emerging major power. It just shows some kind of a lack of sensitivity and I would say inability to accept there are other powers in the world who deserve respect and and recognition for what they are. So I think here it's the Chinese who are coming across in a bad light.
Okay. How has India made the G20 a more inclusive forum? You've talked of inclusivity of citizenry, but the Prime Minister has said that the African Union also joined the G20 on India's invitation, and the voice of the people of Africa has reached this important platform, and India's special invitee guest countries are Bangladesh, Egypt, Mauritius, Netherlands, Nigeria, Oman, Singapore, Spain, and the UAE. And we've also invited international organizations like UN, IMF, World Bank, WHO, WTO, ILO, ASEAN Chair, ADB, ISA, etc.
Look, when a country of a size of 1.4 billion people hosts an event like this, the message that is going across today is that we have a heart and a mind that is large enough to accommodate every single shade of opinion and region of the world. And that is the fundamental kind of manifestation of our commitment to inclusivity. So it's not that we just practice inclusivity at home, but we want to practice it globally. And yes, I think the Indian initiative to get the African Union into the G20 is a great initiative. It will be a legacy initiative which will go down, and the New Delhi summit will be remembered for the fact that the African Union was included in the G20. But the other aspect of inclusivity which I think we must speak about is the manner in which India has been the spokesperson of the voice, or the voice rather, of the global South. And this is a particularly direct impact of the Ukraine conflict, where the subtext is that where the conflict is taking place is between the two major power centers of the world, the military powers and the richest countries of the world. Somewhere down the line, the parties to the conflict seem to have forgotten that there is another majority out there in the world who have very, very serious issues and problems. And those are not getting the attention they deserve because of this conflict, which has dominated the global mass media for the last year and a half, to the exclusion of every other single problem, including existential problems like climate change, like indebtedness, like high energy prices, like food shortages, like high interest rates.
Everything has taken a backseat.
So everything has taken a backseat. In fact, including even to the point where potential humanitarian disasters like Afghanistan, like Yemen, like Sudan, all these have been relegated to the background. And India has taken this initiative to say, this time around, we will make sure that the voices of the global South must and will be heard in these forums. Because without that, you cannot have a stable global order. You cannot have prosperity and harmony if the agenda and the concerns of the vast humanity of the world are not taken cognizance of.
After India took over the presidency of the G20 in Bali last year, it decentralized diplomatic events, something that Mr. Modi has been doing from the time he took charge. I remember he invited President Xi Jinping to Ahmedabad, and after that, subsequently, many world leaders went to many places other than New Delhi, which has been the tradition. So, as we've discussed this already, that events are being held, about 200 meetings have been held, are going to be held actually during the entire term of the presidency in 60 Indian cities. And that's how you explain the involvement of the citizenry. But how is this tradition going to change future G20 events? Do you think, since we have this rotating presidency in G20, countries that take over from the country that takes over from us and the countries that take over subsequently in years to come will be able to do something that India has done?
Well, I think it will be a hard act to follow after the kind of energy that India has put in under Prime Minister Modi's leadership to completely change the character of the G20 grouping. And as I said, to take it out of the narrow confines of conference halls and meeting rooms,
Right.
to take it right down to the people. So to capture the imagination of the people. So I think, yes, absolutely. I mean, the decision to take all this out of the capital and even to the smallest of cities, starting from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, etc., is part and parcel of this Indian characteristic, to impart an Indian character to the G20. And I know that Brazil, I've heard, is fearful whether they can actually match the levels of energy and the number of meetings, etc. But if you look at each of the meetings and you study the documents of all the working groups and all the meetings and everything else, and not just the G20, you have other non-government forums like the T20, the B20,
The engagement groups.
A lot of hard work has been done, and someone has done that hard work.
I was reading there's an engagement group on startups.
But if you look at the documentation and the paperwork, that all requires a lot of hard work, a lot of disciplined, high quality work, which has actually been put in by the presidency. So you have an army of Indian officials who are working behind the scenes to put together these tomes of documents and reams of paper outlining every single thing without any errors, to make sure that there is consensus, to actually work overtime to also not just ensure consensus, but to put out the Indian view and the Indian perspective on each of these issues, and to bring to the fore those issues which either are of relevance and concern to the vast majority, or those issues in which India has something to share with the world. And at the same time, to also provide that healing touch to the global economy, because I don't think you can have one single big outcome in this summit when it happens. There will be a few big takeaways, but the combination of all of them will be such that they will add to the restoration of confidence in the global economy, and hopefully the revival of the global economy on the right path, which is the green path. So if we can manage to do that, and if we can manage to pull out some of the secrets of success, such as the digital public infrastructure that we have developed, etc., then we will be able to transform the lives, because we want the rich countries, we want the whole global economy to grow, frankly. And today, India is, as I said, the bright spot. Today, our GDP is more than double of what it was when the first G20 summit was held in 2008. And it is expected by all yardsticks that this GDP of 3 trillion is going to become 6 trillion in the next few years. So India is being looked upon in this light. So there's a lot of responsibility on India, and simultaneously there is a lot of opportunity for India to continue with this high growth path.
You already talked of the legacy that India will create, and as an element you mentioned the African Union. But other than that, how do you think this leadership document, the paper, the outcome paper that will emerge at the end of the leaders' declaration, how do you think it will look like?
As I said, I think it'll be a long document. We hope it'll be consensus.
Very difficult to have so many people on board on.
Well, it's just Russia and China which actually have to agree to a consensus document, and also the G7 has to pitch in.
Right.
So on the one hand you have the G7, on the other you have Russia and China. So these two sets of countries have to actually also contribute and pitch in to ensure that there is consensus on burning issues of our times. I think this document, or the outcomes, there will be manifold outcomes, multiple outcomes, but if we can focus only on 4 or 5 of them, then that should become the legacy for this summit, where we talk about as I said, Global South. We talk about sustainable patterns and models of development. We talk about digital public infrastructure. And we talk about stability in trade, in financial flows, in new forms of development cooperation. We address the problems of indebtedness. You do not want initiatives continuing which trap countries into indebtedness. You want countries to go out of indebtedness. You want a level playing field in the world. And the use of technology as a driver for future prosperity are all these things which one would look forward to.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Saran. I would like to express my gratitude to you once again for giving our viewers such a useful overview of what the G20 will be like, what the summit will be like, and to take us through this journey that India started with so much optimism. And I think only a diplomat of your stature can do this in no time. So I'm not wrong when I say that you breathe diplomacy. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tripti. Thank you so much.